Rebecca Solnit is an American writer, historian, and cultural critic, based in the San Francisco Bay Area, whose work spans more than 20 books across memoir, feminist theory, environmental thought, political commentary, and cultural history, including Orwell's Roses, Recollections of My Non-Existence, The Faraway Nearby, Wanderlust, A Field Guide to Getting Lost, River of Shadows, and Men Explain Things to Me. She is known for connecting historical narratives with contemporary social and political issues, writing extensively on feminism, activism, climate justice, hope, and democratic movements. Her essays appear regularly in The Guardian and other major outlets, and her books have earned significant recognition, including major literary awards such as the National Book Critics Circle Award, and shortlistings for the Orwell Prize for Political Writing and the James Tate Black Award. Solnit remains influential for her clear, historically informed analysis, and her ability to frame cultural and political challenges within broader conversations about power, imagination, and social change. A Paradise Built in Hell examines how ordinary people consistently respond to disasters with altruism, solidarity, and spontaneous community, rather than panic or selfishness, challenging long-held assumptions about human nature and official narratives of chaos. Drawing on 5 case studies, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the 1917 Halifax explosion, the 1985 Mexico City earthquake, the aftermath of 9/11 in New York, and Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, Solnit shows that catastrophic events often generate what she calls disaster utopias, brief periods in which social barriers fall, purpose intensifies, and cooperative networks flourish. She contrasts these grassroots responses with the actions of authorities, who often react with fear, repression, or elite panic, exacerbating harm. Through historical analysis, interviews, and cultural reflection, Solnit argues that these moments reveal a fundamental human capacity for mutual aid and collective meaning, suggesting that the possibility of a more connected and compassionate society is latent within us, and visible most clearly in times of crisis. The chapter, Beloved Community, examines how disaster and political crisis give rise to beloved community, tracing connections between civil rights-era ideals and the grassroots responses to Hurricane Katrina. Solnit begins with the political fallout from Katrina for the Bush administration, and the parallel emergence of Camp Casey, Cindy Sheehan's anti-war encampment in Texas, which functioned as a temporary community of shared grief, purpose, and political conversation. She links this to Martin Luther King Jr.'s concept of the beloved community as a vision not only against injustice, but for integration, reconciliation, and everyday fellowship, and argues that activist movements and disaster communities alike generate intense experiences of solidarity, meaning, and social joy. After Katrina, faith-based groups, veterans, anarchists, and countercultural networks such as the Rainbow Family and emergent organizations like Common Ground and Emergency Communities created improvised kitchens, clinics, housing projects, and mutual aid hubs that both supported local residents and transformed volunteers' understanding of race, class, and responsibility. These efforts, often more agile and responsive than large bureaucracies, blurred the line between helper and helped and demonstrated how pre-existing subcultures of service and resistance can function as latent disaster communities, even as they struggled internally with power, sustainability, and institutionalization. Set against these experiments in solidarity is the contrasting trajectory of official responses in New Orleans: privatization of schools and housing, closure of Charity Hospital, weakened public transit, and neglect or destruction of community institutions, which extended the disaster rather than repaired it. The political shift triggered by Hurricane Katrina explains that Hurricane Katrina dramatically changed how people viewed the U.S. government, especially President George W. Bush. When the storm hit, the federal response was slow and disorganized, and the public saw clear evidence that officials had been warned about the risk of the levees breaking but failed to act. News coverage highlighted these failures, and many Americans who had previously been hesitant to criticize the administration began speaking out. As trust in the president collapsed, the disaster helped shift the country's political mood, bringing more attention to issues like poverty and racial inequality, and opening space for new political leaders who focused on those problems. Camp Casey and the Rise of Grassroots Anti-War Activism describes how Cindy Sheehan, whose son was killed in the Iraq War, set up a protest camp outside President Bush's ranch to demand an explanation for why her son died. Her personal grief struck a national nerve and inspired many people to join her, turning the area into a temporary community of activists who shared the same questions and frustrations about the war. What began as one mother's search for answers quickly became a powerful symbol of grassroots opposition, showing how deeply felt loss can bring people together and spark a broader movement. The idea of the beloved community comes from Black church traditions and the civil rights movement, where groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee used it to describe a society built on equality, compassion, and cooperation. Martin Luther King Jr. saw it as a vision that required not just changing laws and institutions, but also changing how people think, act, and treat one another in daily life. Activist groups that form around shared causes often give people a strong sense of connection and purpose, creating temporary communities where usual social barriers fade away, much like the close-knit bonds that appear in the aftermath of disasters. Activist and countercultural subcultures as latent disaster communities explains that many activist groups and alternative communities, whether conservative church networks or countercultural circles, already have strong habits of helping one another, even before a disaster strikes. Because they are built on shared values, trust, and a belief in looking out for others, they can quickly shift into action when a crisis happens. Their ability to respond isn't created by the disaster itself, it comes from the relationships, commitments, and sense of community they have built over time. Solnit uses rainbow gatherings as a concrete example of how countercultural communities develop practical skills and social habits that resemble disaster relief work. Rainbow gatherings are large, temporary encampments that have taken place annually since the early 1970s, often in national forests and other remote sites. Participants create a functioning mini-society from scratch. They select locations with access to drinkable water, pipe that water into camp, dig latrines to prevent disease, and set up shared kitchens and medical support, all organized through informal networks and consensus rather than formal hierarchies. The entire infrastructure, water, sanitation, food, and basic care, is run by volunteers, driven by a shared commitment to communal living rather than profit or formal authority. Solnit emphasizes that these gatherings operate on a gift economy and a culture of mutual aid. Food is cooked and given away in communal kitchens, medical care is provided by volunteer medics, and people contribute labor, skills, and supplies without direct payment. This sets rainbow gatherings apart from commercialized festivals such as Burning Man, which charge high admission, rely heavily on paid services, contract professional sanitation and medical providers, and are run by a limited liability corporation. At Rainbow, by contrast, admission is free, everyone is welcome, and the work of sustaining the camp, feeding thousands, maintaining hygiene, and caring for the sick or injured, is collectively organized and informally governed. For Solnit, this shows a fuzzy but functioning version of the beloved community, a voluntary, improvised society built around sharing, cooperation, and service rather than monetary exchange. Because Rainbow participants are accustomed to living in primitive conditions and organizing large-scale, non-commercial camps, they were well-positioned to respond when Hurricane Katrina struck. Solnit recounts the example of a Rainbow participant known as Hawker, who received calls from other Rainbow friends urging him to go to the Gulf Coast and feed folks. He pointed out that the group already knew how to keep people healthy in rough, infrastructure-poor settings, and how to set up something like a refugee camp, so it felt natural for them to mobilize. Hawker and others converged on Waveland, Mississippi, a town effectively wiped out by a 30-foot storm surge, and set up an improvised relief operation focused on providing food and basic needs in a landscape where conventional systems had collapsed. Through this example, the section shows how rainbow gatherings and similar countercultural traditions function as latent disaster communities. They rehearse ways of living, organizing, and caring for each other outside the market and formal institutions, and these capacities can be quickly redirected toward disaster relief. What might look like a marginal subculture, people camping in the woods, cooking together, and practicing consensus decision-making, turns out to preserve knowledge and social forms that are highly effective when official systems fail. In Solnit's larger argument, Rainbow's post-Katrina work demonstrates how these mutual aid traditions can step into the gaps left by slow or inadequate state and corporate responses, embodying, however imperfectly, the kind of solidarity-based community that disasters make visible. Expanding the concept of social movements explains that social movements often grow beyond simple opposition and become experiments in building new ways of living together. Activists don't just protest problems, they create practical alternatives such as cooperative businesses, organic farms, community clinics, and cultural festivals that model the kind of society they want to see. In doing so, movements give people a strong sense of belonging, purpose, and shared commitment, bringing together individuals who might never otherwise meet. These bonds resemble the deep, immediate connections that arise after disasters, when people unite to help one another and imagine new possibilities for community life. Volunteerism and the Reconstruction of Post-Katrina New Orleans describes how Hurricane Katrina shattered many of New Orleans' long-standing communities by scattering residents across the country and compounding that physical separation with deep emotional trauma. When volunteers arrived from outside the region, they not only helped rebuild damaged neighborhoods, but also revived parts of the social fabric by supporting local residents who were trying to return and recover. In the process, volunteers formed their own temporary communities based on shared effort and mutual support, building friendships and alliances that crossed old social, racial, and cultural divides. Their presence brought new energy and new ways of working together, introducing collaborative approaches that shaped the city's ongoing reconstruction and left lasting connections between people who might never have otherwise met. Governmental abandonment and structural privatization explains that after Hurricane Katrina, government leaders in New Orleans and at the state and federal levels made policy choices that deepened the city's suffering instead of easing it. Rather than rebuilding public systems, officials used the disaster as an opportunity to privatize schools, shut down public housing, leave charity hospital closed, and cut public transit by a large margin, all at a time when residents desperately needed stable homes, medical care, and reliable transportation. These decisions made it much harder for displaced people to return and rebuild their lives, slowed the release of recovery funds, and effectively expanded the disaster by increasing hardship for the very communities the government was supposed to support. Contrasting social visions in the aftermath explains that the aftermath of Katrina exposed two very different ways of understanding society. On one side were residents, volunteers, and civic groups who believed in cooperation, shared responsibility, and the possibility of rebuilding a compassionate community. On the other side were political and economic elites whose reactions were shaped by fear, distrust, and the assumption that people behave selfishly in crises, leading them to make decisions that further harmed vulnerable communities. Despite these clashes and many institutional failures, there were still meaningful successes. Damaged churches and neighborhoods were rebuilt, friendships and alliances formed, and communities across the country became better prepared and more aware of what collective action could achieve when official systems faltered. Long-term transformations and continuing impact explains that Hurricane Katrina left long-lasting effects not only on the physical city, but also on the people who lived through it, and the volunteers who came to help. The disaster reshaped political awareness, inspired new alliances, and changed what many citizens expected from their government and from each other. Individuals carried forward new ideas about solidarity and responsibility, while networks formed during the recovery continued to influence activism and community organizing. Although the trauma and losses left deep scars, the experience also expanded people's sense of what community support and mutual aid could look like, leaving a legacy of stronger civic imagination and a clearer understanding of how ordinary people can step in when official institutions fail. In Solnit's account, the new Waveland Café emerges as a large, improvised relief hub set up in the wreckage of Waveland, Mississippi, after Hurricane Katrina. Rainbow Gathering participants, already experienced in building temporary camp infrastructures, converged on the town and settled in the parking lot of a Fred's food store, where virtually everything had been destroyed by a 30-foot storm surge that left almost nothing salvageable. They joined forces with Bastrop Christian Outreach Center, BCOC, an evangelical church group from Texas, forming a joint operation that combined countercultural and conservative Christian traditions in a single effort to serve the town. Both groups defined their mission in simple emotional terms. They were there to just love on everyone as much as we can, an ethos Solnit treats as very much in the rainbow spirit of mutual aid. Physically, the new Waveland Café was anchored by a common serving area with two main kitchens, one run by Rainbow volunteers and one by Beacock. Over time, volunteers moved back and forth between the two, and the distinction between them blurred as they effectively became one combined operation. The facility was housed in a geodesic dome tent donated by people from Burning Man, under which they served up to 4,000 meals a day, using food largely donated by the Organic Valley Cooperative. Alongside the main serving space, they established what volunteers called a wall-less mart, a free distribution area where residents could obtain basic food, camping gear, clothing, and other necessities, as well as a first aid tent that handled minor medical needs, while a more formal mobile field hospital operated up the road. Daily life at the new Waveland Café was demanding but structured. Volunteers worked extraordinarily long days, often from 7 a.m. until midnight, in temperatures between 95 and 103 degrees Fahrenheit, performing physically intensive tasks such as cooking, serving, cleaning, and managing supplies. Despite the exhausting conditions, one Rainbow volunteer described it as the hardest work he had ever done, but emphasized that the gratitude of local residents who came each morning and thanked the crew for giving them hope made the effort feel worthwhile. Evenings included sitting down to eat with local people, listening to their stories, and offering emotional as well as material support, so the cafe functioned as both a mass-feeding operation and a space for social contact and psychological recovery. Socially, New Waveland embodied the kind of beloved community Solnit is interested in. It brought together latter-day hippies and evangelical Christians, who would ordinarily inhabit separate worlds, but who, under disaster conditions, discovered that their shared sense of mission mattered more than their cultural differences. The collaboration between Rainbow and Beacock showed how stable religious institutions and flexible countercultural groups each contributed distinct strengths. Churches offered continuity, long-standing organizational capacity, and moral languages of service, while Rainbow volunteers contributed improvisational skills, experience with self-organized kitchens and camps, and a readiness to live simply in harsh conditions. Solnit frames the cafe as a textbook example of an emergent organization, arising quickly to meet immediate needs, experimenting with forms of cooperation, and operating outside conventional bureaucratic structures. The new Waveland Café also served as a seedbed for later institutional developments. On December 1, 2005, the café closed, and much of its equipment and many of its crew relocated to St. Bernard Parish, near the lower 9th Ward, to found the Made with Love Café. One of the Waveland volunteers, Mark Weiner, formalized the work by creating the nonprofit Emergency Communities, deliberately structuring it so that, as donated supplies dwindled and the initial surge of goodwill faded, there would still be a sustainable framework for operating community kitchens and support centers. In this sense, what began in a parking lot as an improvised kitchen evolved into a mobile, replicable model that could move wherever need was greatest, broaden its services, and gradually hand over roles and resources to local communities before eventually dissolving. For Solnit, the new Waveland Café encapsulates the core themes of the chapter. It is a vivid example of disaster-born solidarity, the practical overlap between countercultural and religious service traditions, and the transformation of ad hoc relief into enduring forms of civic imagination. The café's combination of mass feeding, free goods distribution, basic medical care, and emotional support, all delivered through volunteer labor and a gift economy ethos, demonstrates how people can rapidly assemble a functioning village in the ruins of a small town. It also illustrates how such projects not only meet immediate survival needs, but also leave behind new relationships, organizational forms, and expectations about what communities can do for themselves when formal systems fail. In the chapter, the Rainbow family appears as a countercultural network whose everyday practices turn out to be highly relevant to disaster relief. Long before Katrina, Rainbow gatherings involved tens of thousands of people camping in remote areas, building temporary villages with communal kitchens, water systems, latrines, and informal healthcare, all organized without formal hierarchy and largely outside the cash economy. Participants are used to improvising infrastructure in difficult conditions, coordinating by consensus, and working long hours as volunteers to feed and care for strangers. This background means that, even though they are often perceived as marginal or eccentric, Rainbow members carry practical knowledge about how to keep large groups of people housed, fed, and healthy in places with little or no pre-existing infrastructure. When Hurricane Katrina struck, members of the Rainbow family quickly recognized that the skills they used at gatherings could be applied directly to the Gulf Coast disaster. One participant, known as Hawker, describes receiving calls from Rainbow friends urging him to go down and feed folks, because they knew how to keep people healthy in primitive settings and how to organize something akin to a refugee camp. Acting on this, Rainbow volunteers converged on the devastated town of Waveland, Mississippi, which had been almost completely wiped out by the storm surge. They set up an improvised camp in a parking lot, began building kitchens and sanitation facilities, and started cooking for anyone who arrived. Their response was not planned by an external authority. It emerged from their own sense of responsibility and their confidence that they already knew how to do this kind of work. In Waveland, Rainbow volunteers soon joined forces with Bastrop Christian Outreach Center, a conservative evangelical church group from Texas. The partnership between Rainbow Family and B.A. Koch is central to Solnit's analysis. It shows how a countercultural, consensus-based community and a structured religious organization can cooperate effectively in a disaster zone. Rainbow volunteers brought their experience in setting up free kitchens, organizing camps without money, and living rough for extended periods. The church group contributed stable leadership, logistical support, and a religious language of service and loving on people in need. Together, they created the new Waveland Café, serving thousands of meals a day, distributing donated goods, and offering basic medical support. Over time, the distinction between Rainbow and church kitchens blurred, as volunteers moved between them and the operation functioned as a single, integrated relief effort. Rainbow family involvement also reshaped the social atmosphere of the relief site. Their culture emphasizes welcome, openness, and a gift economy, where food and care are given freely and everyone is encouraged to participate in the work. At New Waveland, this translated into a setting where local residents were not only fed, but also invited into a more equal, communal space that contrasted sharply with bureaucratic or transactional forms of aid. Volunteers worked exhausting days in extreme heat, yet many described the experience as profoundly meaningful because of the gratitude and emotional connection they felt with local people. The Rainbow ethos of greeting newcomers with warmth and treating everyone as part of a temporary family helped turn the relief camp into a social as well as material support system. Solnit uses the Rainbow family's Katrina work to illustrate her broader concept of latent disaster communities. Rainbow gatherings, with their emphasis on collective labor, consensus decision-making, and non-commercial exchange, are presented as a kind of ongoing rehearsal for disaster response. The Rainbow Network exists in ordinary times as a parallel society, practicing mutual aid, improvisation, and cooperation. When a major catastrophe occurs, these patterns can be activated almost immediately, allowing Rainbow volunteers to step into roles that formal institutions may be too slow, too rigid, or too under-resourced to fill. Their presence in Waveland demonstrates that what looks like a marginal subculture can, in crisis, become an important part of the civic infrastructure. Finally, Rainbow family involvement in Katrina did not end with the initial emergency. The experience at New Waveland fed into more formalized efforts, most notably the creation of the non-profit emergency communities and the opening of successor projects like the Made with Love Café in St. Bernard Parish. Many of the people and much of the equipment from New Waveland moved on to these new sites, carrying forward the Rainbow-informed model of free kitchens, volunteer-run distribution centers, and communal spaces for recovery. In this way, Rainbow participation helped turn spontaneous, ad hoc relief into an evolving practice, leaving behind not only memories and personal transformations, but also organizational forms and precedents that could be adapted for future disasters. The following is a deep research report on Rainbow family involvement with the New Waveland Café from contemporaneous news sources. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, August 2005, volunteers from the Bastrop Christian Outreach Center, BCOC, a Pentecostal church group from Bastrop, Texas, and the Rainbow Family of Living Light converged on Waveland, Mississippi to provide aid. The Bastrop Christians arrived first, early September 2005, to set up a camp across from the police station and water tower. As Peter and Faye Jones later recounted, Bastrop members pulled bodies from the wreckage and erected tents, just as local survivors, many naked after the storm ripped away their clothes, began emerging from the woods. Within days, the Rainbow Family, a loose anarchist non-organization of free-spirited countercultural volunteers, arrived in buses bringing organic foods. A joint operation quickly formed. Peacock volunteers provided logistics, food, trucks, water, while Rainbow volunteers ran a communal kitchen. Together they opened the new Waveland Café and Clinic in a demolished shopping center parking lot. One Baptiste minister later marveled that we never thought we would have such a wonderful relationship with hippies, but by late 2005 the two groups were working side by side in an unlikely alliance of God-fearing churchgoers and free-spirited hippies. At its peak, the new Waveland Café served hundreds, often over 1,000, of free hot meals each day, 3 meals a day to anyone in need. Volunteers built a makeshift dining hall of tents and a 40-foot geodesic dome, loaned from Burning Man, under which non-stop cooking and music took place. Local press reported that Waveland residents hailed these meals as the best meal in town, describing grilled pork, curried vegetables and basmati rice, mostly organic. At its height in September, one Rainbow leader said they served about 2,500 meals a day. By November, the site still delivered roughly 1,000 to 2,000 meals daily. Every week the kitchen received organic produce, dairy and eggs from donors like Organic Valley, while churches, international aid groups and companies sent additional staples and meat. Volunteers ranged from homeschooling families to retirees, and an elderly Methodist from Kentucky was filmed cheerfully handing out teddy bears alongside Ty Duth. In addition to feeding people, the site included a medical clinic and a supply depot. Under a separate tent, volunteer doctors, nurses, and EMTs offered free care around the clock. According to one account, the new Waveland Clinic recorded over 5,000 patient encounters during its 3-month run, providing everything from first aid and minor surgery to vaccinations against tetanus and hepatitis. Nearby, the Texas Church volunteers set up a store offering free supplies, canned/boxed food, bottled water, diapers, baby supplies, clothing, hygiene items, pet food and more, for any survivor who needed them. Firefighters even jury-rigged hot showers by plumbing water tanks and generators. In all, the site operated as a 24/7 relief hub, a kitchen for food, a clinic for health, and a donation center for essentials. Children had a designated art/play area, with counselors on hand, and volunteers kept spirits high by leading dance classes, impromptu music bands, Freaky Friday costume parties, and even singing Happy Birthday to empty tables. As one organizer put it, "We're not just passing out food, you're seeing life here," contrasting the bureaucratic aid organizations that had largely stayed away. The new Waveland Café was run without formal hierarchy or government. The Rainbow family volunteers emphasized a non-hierarchical, consensus-based approach. There were no official leaders, officers, or dues, and decisions were made communally. One organizer explained that this was literally their first experience running a disaster relief center, but their working knowledge of feeding large numbers of people from music festival gatherings meant they adapted quickly. About 40 Rainbow volunteers, plus roughly 50 Christian volunteers, rotated through the camp at any one time. They pooled skills freely. For example, a Rainbow medic, known as Sister Soup, became a dance instructor for locals, while others offered massages, herbal remedies, and extended first aid shifts. One volunteer noted that FEMA agents initially told them, "You can't do this, it's not in the manual," but the group simply proceeded anyway. In practice, the camp remained cooperative. They welcomed any outsider who showed up to help, even without official credentialing, and got along with government agencies when possible. By November, the organizers were coordinating with FEMA, the National Guard, and the Army Corps. Supplies were being formally shipped from the State Emergency Operations Center to the site. As one Rainbow volunteer put it, "We're working with any and all groups, Christian or non-Christian, FEMA or National Guard, anyone and everyone." Local reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Survivors and nearby residents warmly embraced the impromptu relief village. A Bay St. Louis resident, Varnum skipper Sheldon, said, "You can wake up in the morning and have a smile coming over here. It's one of the most important things for survival." Gulf Coast locals remarked that everyone, regardless of race or politics, pulled together during this crisis. One Rainbow volunteer from Wisconsin even quipped, "Hancock County, Mississippi, it's really conservative." "How did you guys break in?" I said. "Conservative? I hadn't noticed. Everyone has a common mission, so all the barriers go away." Journalists noted the festive atmosphere, bands played on makeshift stages, kids danced, and even on Freaky Friday volunteers dressed in the oddest donated clothes to make people laugh. The quality of the aid was noted too. Media reported that Red Cross workers were so impressed that one even quit to join the Rainbow Kitchen. In Deseret News, a Mormon-published paper, an AP photographer captured a Methodist handing out teddy bears next to a tattooed rainbow volunteer in a dress, proclaiming it just wonderful. The volunteers themselves also expressed gratitude for the experience. By late November, about 3 months in, many were preparing to move on. For Thanksgiving they planned a grand banquet, complete with turkey and the rainbow-inspired side of seaweed, and a parade down Highway 90 as a farewell. In final speeches they marveled at how working in a wall-less, prejudice-less environment had changed them. One organizer said he dreaded leaving this new community of everyone so close, while another earnestly noted that the only thing they gained from the ordeal was everything, a sense of pride that they had helped humanity in need. Contemporary reports contain almost no direct criticism of the new Waveland effort. In fact, media coverage was uniformly positive or amazed at this grassroots success. The only friction noted was early bureaucratic hurdles. In October, authorities briefly tried to shut down the Rainbow Kitchen because it was not in the manual, and volunteers initially had to bring their own supplies through National Guard checkpoints. Some accounts cheekily mentioned that local police looked the other way when a whiff of marijuana drifted from the camp, but these were treated as humorous side notes rather than scandals. Locals expressed astonishment that a poor rural town was being fed not by FEMA or Red Cross, but by a motley crew of hippies and churchfolk. As one reporter wrote, this gospel and granola bond had truly bridged stereotypes. No mainstream source reported any organized criticism or hostility towards the cafe. If anything, the relief team was seen as God sent by survivors. A passing web rumor years later alleged some governor's office warnings against evil hippies, but credible news outlets of 2005-06 mention none of that. The new Waveland Café closed in early December 2005, as Waveland's own stores and services began to reopen. Its volunteers quickly turned their focus to other hard-hit areas. In particular, co-founder Mark Weiner, ex-Rainbow, founded the nonprofit Emergency Communities, and opened the Made with Love Café in heavily damaged St. Bernard Parish, east of New Orleans, in December 2005. That relief kitchen, staffed by many of the same volunteers and using the Waveland model, served on the order of 1,300 meals each day, and offered distribution of clothing/toys, and a rejuvenation station with free first aid and massages. Over roughly 6 months, Emergency Communities reported serving about 160,000 meals to 15,000 residents and workers in New Orleans' 9th Ward and St. Bernard Parish. Independent verification of these tallies is difficult, but the scale was unquestionably large for a volunteer effort. Other rainbow-linked relief projects sprang up too. For example, volunteers who had served at Waveland later ran Camp Second Helpin', an 8-month-long family relief center in Mississippi serving 2 hot meals a day and housing reconstruction crews. In sum, the Rainbow family's role at New Waveland, alongside Bastrop Christian Outreach Center and other helpers, became a celebrated example of grassroots disaster relief. Observers noted that this countercultural non-organization delivered essential services faster and with more community involvement than some large agencies had managed. It left a legacy of citizen-led aid. The model of open-sourced, volunteer-driven relief spawned Emergency Communities, Made with Love Café, and similar grassroots efforts. As one volunteer put it, the experience proved that peace and love in action could be just what a devastated town needed.